Well, hello, friends. I want to welcome you to How We Got the Bible. This is a special webinar. I am Bishop Andy C. Lewter, and I've had the good fortune, pleasure, and privilege of delivering this particular webinar, How We Got the Bible, both at the University of Yale and Hampton University here of late. And I am so delighted to be sharing this particular webinar with you. Let's begin here, and I pray that you would give me just a few moments to share with you, in my estimation, why this study is so very important. First of all, friends, there is a growing level of biblical literacy in most of the congregations across America. There was a time when people only knew what the pulpit said as it related to both God and the Bible. Of course, during the Middle Ages, people didn't know what the Bible said. They only knew what the priest said that the Bible said. However, this is a different day, a different time, and with all of the biblical resources that are available today, no longer can we just say anything from the pulpit. With Google, handheld devices, and so many other tools that relate to the Bible. We are held to a higher standard of accountability. In any given Sunday, when the pastor quotes a particular passage of scripture, there very well may be five, six, even seven different translations that's being read by the various people in that congregation. This study is important because it helps to explain the various translations that we come in contact with every week. And then I also want to argue that this study is important because it helps to defend us against critics and cynics who would use the material and the information that we're going to talk about today in a negative fashion. All right, that allows us to move on just a little bit further. And I want to kind of continue this discussion on why this is important. The Bible is our sacred literature. And let me say at this juncture that nothing that I say over the course of these next several minutes is intended or designed to disturb the placement of the Bible as your sacred literature. I will confess to you that I'm looking at the Bible, approaching the Bible from a historical perspective, and I'm looking at the historical development of the Bible, not so much its faith value. I'm not going to deal, there is a course that I teach on modern literary criticism where I talk about high criticism, low criticism. I talk about the Yahwistic, the Elohistic, the Deuteronomic, and the priestly documents in the Old Testament, the Markan source, the Q source, the sign source, the discourse source in the New Testament. Those are pre-literary stages of the Bible. But this study is going to concentrate on the Bible once written, once it was reduced to writing. What was the path, historical path, that it took to get to where we are today? And of course, that will have a great deal to do with the notions of inerrancy and literalism. Let me just do this exercise in your hearing. If I were to ask you to quote John 3:16, no doubt all of you would recite, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." Now, here is the truth of the matter. That comes to us from the Gospel of John. John did not know English. Therefore, there must have been a path and a process involved that took the Bible from its original language, which was Koine Greek as it relates to the New Testament, all the way to our ability to read it today, which is in English. This study examines how that took place. And for those of you who are pulpiteers and do preaching, this study is important because of exegesis and hermeneutics. Now, exegesis is being consistent and compliant with what the original author intended for the text. When we make the Bible say what we want it to say, then we are guilty of eisegesis. And so, in the area of exegesis and hermeneutics, it's very, very important to understand where the Bible came from. Three final thoughts that I'd like to share with you in terms of why this study is important, or the continued message on why this study is important. It has to do with apologetics and this defensore de la fe, which is a term that means defender of the faith. Now, let me explain here that apologetics is not apology. Apology is saying you're sorry. We're not saying we're sorry for the Bible. But we're using the term apologetics in its more literal sense, where it literally means a rigorous defense of the text. And so we want to understand the text so that we put ourselves in a position to be able to defend the text more effectively. And of course, these last two items are equally important, and that is that this study is important, not that it will take away, but rather that it will add to the affirmation of our faith. Truth is truth. 2 plus 2 is 4. 4 is truth. But also, 6 minus 2 is 4. Now you arrive at the same conclusion, 4, but it does make a difference how you get there. One, you get there in a positive way by adding to. The other, you get there in a negative way by taking away from. This study is intended not to take away from any of your faith, but it is intended to add to your faith. And then let me just say a word about personal edification. As members of the body of Christ, we indeed, and you've heard this text so many times, study to show ourselves approved. And so this material allows us to study the Word of God in a more rigorous kind of way, so that we indeed can be approved and worthy to stand and preach and teach and project and share God's Word. Well, let's get started, and I want to get started with three basic terms. And it's so very important that you understand these terms, because without a accurate understanding of these terms, most of what I'm going to explain in this webinar may not make sense. I want to begin with this term, and that is autographs. Autographs were the original documents that were written by the author or a scribe under their personal supervision. Now, when I'm talking about autographs, I'm talking about the original documents. What is the actual parchment or papyri that Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers upon? The actual authentic first generation document that was used by any of the authors of either the Old Testament or the New Testament. Now you'll notice here that I also include scribe under their personal supervision. What we do know, beloved, is that many of the persons who were involved in the development of the Bible, especially in its earliest stages, were illiterate individuals. They could not read nor write. So it is unlikely that they actually penned letters or gospels or prophetic sayings themselves. In many instances, they were assisted by a secretary or a scribe who took their words, reduced it to writing for them, because they themselves did not have the ability to read or write. Okay, that brings us to manuscripts, and this is very important, friends. Manuscripts are copies of the original autographs written on papyri or on parchment. So what you have is the autograph. That's the first generation document, what was actually written by the author, whether it's an epistle, a gospel, an Old Testament book. The autograph would be the book that that author actually wrote. A manuscript would be a copy of that autograph. Now, understand this. The manuscript is not the book itself. It is a copy. Therefore, it is subject to any discrepancy that may have been produced in the copying process. Authors were the actual writers of the book. Copyists were those persons who copied what they had available to them into another document. And that brings us to the third item, which is a translation. Now, it's important that you understand the difference between all of these terms. Translations are copies of the biblical text, and in most instances, actually in every instance, it was a copy of a manuscript. But what makes a translation different is that a translation is a copy, but it is a copy written in another language other than the language of the manuscript. So if we're talking about the Old Testament, a copy would appear in Hebrew because Hebrew is the original language. However, a copy that is in Greek is not a manuscript, it is a translation. Anytime the text moves from one language to another, you're dealing with a translation, not a manuscript, not an original autograph, but a translation. Okay, now let's see how this all kind of comes together. And I think you'll find this somewhat fascinating. Item number one, there are no surviving autographs of any book in the Old Testament. Let me say that again. There are no surviving autographs of any book in the Old Testament. Friends, what this means is that we do not have the original copy, the original writing of any writer in the Old Testament, whether it is Moses, Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel. All of the original writings have been lost to history. And so we start from the premise and from the understanding is that what we have, the oldest documents that we have, are at best copies of the original because we do not have the originals available to us. Secondly, it is generally agreed that the autographs of the Old Testament would have been written either in Aramaic or Hebrew. This is important. While we do not have the original writings of the author, it is our scholastic assumption that if they were available, they would come to us either in Aramaic or Hebrew. I personally believe that the original autographs would have been in Hebrew. I'll explain that in just a few minutes. Okay, now since we do not have autographs, that means that the oldest documents that we do have are manuscripts. They are copies of the original autographs. And in many instances, they're not even a first generation copy or a second generation copy. Sometimes, as you will see in just a few moments, these are copies that were not penned and produced until hundreds, even sometimes thousands of years after the original autograph had been produced. We begin here with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm going to try and give these to you in somewhat of a chronological order. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the desert in the Sinai, between, and it is believed that they were written between the years 200 BC and 70 AD. Now that's a pretty good span, 200 BC to 70 AD. It's almost 300 years. That somewhere within that 300 years is when we believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. Now, remember, these are manuscripts, so these are not the original documents, but these are copies. And in this case, these are copies of copies of copies. We believe that the original writing of Moses, let's take Moses for an example, in terms of the Old Testament, that his writings could have been as far back as 4004 BC. Well, even if we take the earliest Dead Sea Scroll date of 200, that would mean that the Dead Sea Scrolls were not even written until 3,800 years after Moses wrote his original autograph. That's an immense amount of time. Okay, the second category for manuscripts in the Old Testament is what we call the Geniza fragments. The Geniza fragments. They were discovered in Cairo, and using the science that we have available to us today and the dating process, we now know that the Geniza fragments were written around the year 400 AD. So we're now looking at almost 4,500 years after the original autographs. 400 AD, AD meaning in the year of our Lord. The most popular of all of the Old Testament manuscripts that we do have available to us are referred to as the Ben Asher manuscripts, written between the years of 700 to 900 AD. These manuscripts are also referred to as the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text. It is the most popular of all of the Old Testament manuscripts that we have available to us today. If you take a look at this time period, 700 to 900 AD, it does not take much to figure out that while Ben Asher is given credit for these volumes and this library, he certainly could not have been responsible for the complete volume. 700 to 900 is 200 years. That's obviously more time than he had available on earth. In actuality, the Ben Asher manuscripts, also known as the Masoretic text, was a family that preserved Old Testament manuscripts. And so we believe that Ben Asher may have done some writing, some copying, followed by his sons, grandsons, even great grandsons, so that over this 200-year period, we end up with a set of manuscripts that reflect the contents of the Old Testament. But again, we're looking at 4,000 years of Old Testament history added on to 700 to 900 years. So you're looking at documents that were written 5,000 years after the original documents were written in the Old Testament. Now, after we deal with manuscripts, remember, manuscripts are written in the same language as the original. That's why all of what we talked about, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Geniza fragments, and the Masoretic texts or the Ben Asher manuscripts are all in Hebrew because the original documents would have been in Hebrew. I want to share with you now two Old Testament translations, and there are many. And when I say many, I mean many translations, but two of the more well known translations that you no doubt have heard about and are probably familiar with. The first would be the Aramaic Targums, the Aramaic Targums, 400 BCE. It is the Old Testament translated to Aramaic. Aramaic, and this is very interesting, even fascinating. Aramaic, even though spoken by Jesus, was not an original language of the Jews. This is an adopted language that the Jews acquired once they had been captured by Nebuchadnezzar and taken hostage and held captive in Babylon, or part of their Babylonian captivity. It is the language that they picked up and began to speak once they were in the Babylonian captivity. Now, it became so popular until it stuck with the people, stuck with the Jews. So much so until by the time that Jesus is born, nearly 400 years later, his people are still speaking Aramaic. This translation thus proves, because it is a translation, it thus proves that the original documents must have been in Hebrew because there would have been no need to do a translation into Aramaic if the original documents had been in Aramaic themselves. And of course, the other very, very popular translation of the Old Testament is represented with an LXX. It was written around 250 BCE, and it is a Greek translation. So remember, the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. Around 250 BC, there is a Greek translation translated by 70 to 72 men from Aramaic or Hebrew. Now, this has a lot to do with Alexander the Great, Hellenism, the belief in a one world system, and because Greek had become the most dominant language of that part of the world, pretty much as English is a dominant language today. The Jews, Alexander the Great, the whole socio-political system of that time necessitated that the Bible be translated out of its original tongue of Hebrew into the more common, the more widely spoken Greek language. And of course, that Greek version, or the Greek version of the Old Testament, we refer to as the Septuagint. Okay, that allows us now to move to the New Testament. And I want to begin with New Testament autographs. You're going to find some similarities between the Old Testament and the New Testament, not so much in terms of dates, but certainly in terms of availability. Written between 45 AD and 95 AD, these New Testament autographs include the Gospels, letters, and apocalyptic literature, which we would commonly refer to as Revelation, or books like the Revelation. Now, perhaps I should say here that all of the books that were written for the Bible, especially in the New Testament, did not make what I call the canon cut. They were not accepted into the canon. That's another whole lesson. But what we have in terms of the 27 books of the New Testament are books that were filtered, negotiated, and decided upon much later than their writings, that they were written by one set of people, but the persons who decided what would actually go in the Bible was a different set of people, and these two groups were separated by hundreds of years. All right, so 45 AD to 95 AD, and it includes Gospels, letters, apocalyptic literature. Now, the Gospels that you know are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The letters that you know are written by Paul and Peter. Uh, but there were more Gospels, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but there was the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas. So there were several other books, many of which were not included in the canon, so they do not appear in the Bible that you're most familiar with. This 3rd Corinthians, 4th Corinthians, apocalyptic literature, the Acts of Peter, the revelation of Peter, the revelation of some of the other disciples. Again, it did not make the cut of the canon, and so it is not included in the 27 books that you're familiar with in the New Testament. Now, I have to insert this, and again, this is equally important, friends. Like the Old Testament, there are no surviving original autographs of any book of the New Testament. I'm going to say that again. Like the Old Testament, there are no surviving original autographs of any book of the New Testament, which means that when it comes even to the New Testament, we do not have the original writing of the Apostle Paul, the original writing of the Apostle Peter. We do not have the original writing of John. What we have, again, are copies, manuscripts, and translations, but we do not have the actual original document of any book of the New Testament. Now, this slide has to do with literary or textual criticism. Again, I'm not going to deal with this so much. It should be noted that this study is on the written Bible. Again, literary and textual criticism looks at what the Bible was before the Bible became the Bible, meaning that there was an oral tradition or a pre-literary tradition. In other words, we believe that before there was ever any books written down by either the apostles or even the gospel writers, that there were decades when people were simply telling the story of Jesus. The two dates that you might want to be familiar with is Jesus leaves the earth realm around 30 AD. The first gospel is not written about Jesus until 62 AD. So it's obvious that there's a 32-year period between Jesus's exit from the earth realm and, of course, the first gospel written about him, which was the Gospel of Mark. We contend and argue that during those 32 years, uh, the gospel, the story of Jesus, was in an oral form, almost like the African griots of old who used to tell stories from and pass those stories down from generation to generation. We believe those 32 years was filled and punctuated with people who were telling the story of Jesus. Many of them had seen Jesus for themselves, and so they had a first-hand account. They were first-generation Christians who assumed that Jesus would return during their earthly lifetime. There is a technical term called the delay of the parousia, which means when Jesus did not return, when that first generation of Christians and converts thought Jesus would return, that's when they began to write down the stories of Jesus so they could convey the gospel to the next generation. That generation would not have known Jesus. They would not have seen Jesus. And so the only way they would have known Jesus would have been through a writing, a letter, a book. But that first generation didn't need a book to tell them about Jesus because they had seen him for themselves. Source, form, redaction, criticism teach us that these documents are not the beginning of the Bible, but the end of a rather lengthy oral tradition that preceded it. On other occasions, you can look me up, Google me. I do have material on literary and textual criticism that you might find interesting as well. It is not the focus of this study, and so I do mention it so that you'll have a reference for it, but I will not be expanding upon it here. Okay, we've already ascertained that the New Testament, we do that as it relates to the New Testament, we do not have actual autographs of any writer of any book in the New Testament. What we do have, however, are manuscripts, and I want you to take a look at this. There are over 5,600 Greek copies of the New Testament still in existence today. This picture that you see here to the left is an example of such a manuscript. Now remember, a manuscript is a copy of the original, or a copy of a copy, or a copy of a copy of a copy of the original, written in the same language as the original. So all of these manuscripts, these 5,600 copies or manuscripts, are all written in Greek because Greek is the original language of the New Testament. Now, again, there are 5,600 copies that we do have available to us. I obviously can't give you all 5,600, but I'm going to give you three of the most popular and most well-known manuscripts of the New Testament. They include Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, and Codex Alexandrinus, all written around 350 to 400 AD. Now, Codex Vaticanus, and you see this word Vatican there. Those are the original manuscripts that's in the Vatican, that's in Rome, that's held by the Roman Catholic Church. Codex Sinaiticus is the Palestinian manuscripts, and of course, Codex Alexandrinus are the African. This is named after Alexandria, which is in Africa. So the oldest documents that we do have as it relates to the New Testament, again, were not even written until 350 to 400 years after Jesus' departure from the earth realm. Now, once we move the Bible out of Greek, the next term that I made you familiar with was translations. And so we have 5,600 copies in Greek. But by the time many of these manuscripts were written, Greek was no longer the dominant language of the world. You will remember an individual by the name of Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Octavius Caesar, all of the Roman emperors. They spoke Latin, and because they spoke Latin, there was a very real need to take the Bible out of Greek and to translate it into the tongue of Latin. Known officially as Editio del Vulgata, the Latin Vulgate was translated by Jerome in 380 AD. And so it is the revered church historian and church father, church doctor, Jerome, who actually takes the Greek, the original Greek, and translates it into the language of the world, or the language of his world, which would have been Latin. And of course, the Latin translation of the original New Testament would have been known as the Vulgate. His was one of the first Bibles to include both the Old Testament. I want you to take a look at this. Both the Old Testament, which he translated from the Hebrew, and the New Testament, which he translated from the Greek. So the Vulgate is one of the earliest versions of the Bible that you and I recognize today, because it is composed of both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, I'm inserting here an English Bible only because I'm trying to give you a chronological order of the Bible's development. English Bibles actually come a little later on in my discussion, but because the Wycliffe Bible was translated and written in 1380, it is the next major development in biblical history, or the history of the Bible. The Wycliffe Bible of 1380 was one of the last handwritten translations of the Bible. Now, remember, there was no Xerox, there was no HP, there were no copiers, there was no mass production of the Bible at this time. For a Bible to be reproduced, it had to be handwritten, and it typically took 8 years to make one copy of the Bible. The Wycliffe Bible was done in 1380. Wycliffe translated his Bible from the Vulgate, which made the Wycliffe Bible a translation from a translation, because Wycliffe did not know either Hebrew or Greek. Now, that's one of the reasons that the Wycliffe Bible does not receive the same reverence and is not put on the same level as some of these other early Bibles, because it was translated from the Latin, and the Latin was translated from the Greek. And so the more authentic, or the more highly regarded Bibles are those that go back to the original language. The Wycliffe Bible obviously did not go back to an original language. Let's look at some of the early printed Bibles. And now when I say printed, I'm talking about mass produced, printed on a machine, the technology of the day. I so often say when people tell me that the internet is too worldly, I remind them that what the internet is to us today, the printing press was to the people of the 14th century. And so the church has always used the latest technology available to circulate the word of God. So let's look at some of the early printed Bibles. We begin in the year 1465 with the Gutenberg Bible. It was printed. Gutenberg printed the first Bible, making it possible to produce the Bible in great quantities and at a lower cost. Now, if you've not yet recognized the name Gutenberg, Johannes Gutenberg, was the gentleman who invented the printing press. So the ability to mass produce books today and to typeset books all goes back to Johannes Gutenberg. And it's very interesting that once he invented the printing press, the first document, the first book that he published with his new invention was the Bible. It is actually called the Gutenberg Bible. Alongside the Gutenberg Bible is the Bible of Erasmus, which was translated and printed in an imprint of the New Testament from a Greek manuscript into what he called the Textus Receptus. This takes place in 1514, and the Textus Receptus is one of the earliest books printed in great quantity on this invention called the printing press. That is followed by the Polyglot Bible. This Bible was published in 1522. The Polyglot Bible was published. The Old Testament was in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, and the New Testament in Latin and Greek. Now, if you take a look at the photograph right to the left, you'll see that there are panels, and the Polyglot Bible actually lined up the Bible in these various translations side by side, so that as you see on the left, that's a sample of an Old Testament page, and you have 5 different translations all on the same page with this Polyglot Bible. And then on the right, you see that there are 2 panels. The 2 panels on the right, obviously, is Latin and Greek for New Testament, and then on the left, you have 5 panels, which include Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, or 3 panels, which includes Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. It should be noted that Erasmus used the Polyglot Bible to revise later editions of his New Testament. Okay, I'm going to move pretty quickly here. These are some early English Bibles. I'm going to talk a little bit about the English Bibles that you're more familiar with in just a few minutes. But in terms of chronology and history, it's important that I include in this material some of the earliest English Bibles. Now, the Bible was translated into French, Italian, German. I could go in a number of different directions, but because you read the Bible in English, I really want to concentrate and spend the remainder of my time in this webinar discussing the development of the English Bible. So here we go. We begin with the Bible published and translated by William Tyndale. That took place in 1525. That was followed by the Coverdale Bible, which was published by Miles Coverdale in 1535. So you see there's a 10-year gap between the Tyndale Bible and the Coverdale Bible. Then there was produced the Thomas Matthews Bible of 1537, and let me just push forward here, and then the Great Bible of 1539. Now what is interesting to note is that William Tyndale produced the Tyndale Bible of 1525, but he also produced the Thomas Matthews Bible of 1537. Now, he named his second Bible not after himself as he did the first Bible, but he took one name of a disciple, Thomas, another name of a disciple, Matthews, and he named that Bible the Thomas Matthews Bible. What you're seeing here is a bit of English competition on display here. Tyndale produces a Bible of 1525. Coverdale produces a Bible that is arguably better than the Tyndale Bible. So what happens? Tyndale comes behind him 2 years later and produces a Bible that's better than the Coverdale Bible. And then Coverdale comes behind him and produces what was called the Great Bible of 1539. Again, it is a classic example of English competition as it related to the development and the popularity of certain Bibles. Uh, there are three other early English Bibles that I'd like to acquaint you with, and they include the Geneva Bible, which was published in 1560. Now, we owe a great debt to the Geneva Bible because it was the Geneva Bible that divided and organized the Bible into chapters and verses. And so when you say John 3:16 and you're able to quote it specifically, it is because of the Geneva Bible. We owe a debt of gratitude to the Geneva Bible because after the Geneva Bible, all Bibles copied this format of using chapters and verses. But prior to 1560, the Bible was written almost as a single long paragraph, and so we are very, very grateful that the Geneva Bible became the new convention of the Bible in the 16th century. Elizabeth, called the Virgin Queen, and was a Protestant, daughter of Henry VIII. She decided in 1568, she used a scholar by the name of Matthew Parker because she believed that a Bible should be present in every church in the English realm. She called that Bible the Bishop's Bible of 1568. It was an authorized Bible, and it was one of the first of the authorized English Bibles. And then, of course, we come away with Father Douay, University of Reims, or what's commonly called the Douay Reims Bible, which was produced and published between 1582 to 1610. What is of special note about the Douay Reims Bible is that it was a Roman Catholic Bible. These other Bibles, ever since Luther did his translation with the Gutenberg Bible, those Bibles did not include the Apocrypha, the 14 books between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, there were certain socio-political issues that was confronting the English that caused them to omit these 14 books. Those issues did not face the Roman Catholic Church, and so the Roman Catholic Church had no reason to omit or to exclude the 14 books between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And that is why in most, actually all Roman Catholic Bibles, you will always find the Apocrypha, or those 14 books between what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, I want you to notice the date of the Douay Rheims Bible. It is 1610. The very next year, in 1611, King James VI of Scotland becomes King James I of England. He is the nephew of of Elizabeth, who had been queen. He also is a Protestant, and he replaces the Bishop's Bible with a second authorized Bible that he names after himself, the King James Bible. It was produced in 1611 by authority of King James I by some 50 translators. Some argue that Shakespeare was one of those translators. It was to replace all earlier translation and was the second Bible to be called authorized. Current version, the King James version that we have, was modernized by Benjamin Blaney in 1769 to conform to a more modern English of the time. If I were to give you an actual original King James version of the Bible, you wouldn't be able to read it because the language is so archaic and obsolete until you would, even though we speak English, we would barely be able to recognize it. It was Benjamin Blaney who in 1769 took that original King James and updated it to an 18th century version of Old English. So the doest and the art and the thou, uh, while it is a bit archaic, we are able to read it. That is not because of King James, but it actually is because of Benjamin Blaney. Now I come to the Bibles that you're going to more readily recognize. These are the modern English Bibles. And what I think you're going to find very interesting here is not so much the Bibles themselves, but who used these Bibles or who commissioned these Bibles. Uh, I told you about material and books that had been omitted from the canon way back when the canon was first put together. And much of the decision on what books would be received into the canon and not received into the canon had nothing to do with the content of the book itself. It had to do with who was using the book. And so if the proto-Orthodox movement of the time was not in agreement with the people who were using particular books like the Gnostics and the Marcionites and the Donatists, then books were omitted, not because of content, but because of who was using them. In like fashion, I want you to take a look at these modern English Bibles and pay very close attention to who commissions them and who is responsible for their publishing. We begin with the first revision of the King James version of the Bible. And of course, this is after 1769. Yeah, the revised version. Don't confuse this with the revised standard version. That's going to come up a little bit later. But the first revision of the King James, other than the modernization of the language by Benjamin Blarney, was produced in 1880 by English scholars with American input via correspondence. Now, this is very important because the English Bible, this revised version, allowed American input, but only on a peripheral basis. It is primarily an English document. Only officially recognized, this revised version is the only officially recognized revision of the King James Version. Now, the revised version of 1881 is followed by the American Standard Version of 1901. It was printed that year by Thomas Nelson as per agreement with the revised version. It included notations originally rejected by the British group, copywritten by the National Council of Churches in 1928. Now, this is very, very important because remember, I just indicated to you that American scholars could send letters, correspondence to Great Britain for the British scholars to consider. But the British scholars rejected most of the notations of the American scholars. So in 1901, the American scholars got together, printed their own version of the Bible, which they called the American Standard Version. That brings us to a few other modern English Bibles that I think that you will recognize. The first of which is the Revised Standard Version. This is a revision of the American Standard Version printed in 1952 by the National Council of Churches and distributed by Thomas Nelson Publishers. This RSV, Revised Standard Version, is probably what you are most familiar with, second only to the King James Version. Now, again, it's done by American scholars, and it was intended to be a revision of the American Standard Version that was originally produced in 1901. The translation panel used the 17th edition of the Nestle Allen Greek text for the New Testament and the traditional, oh, look at this, Hebrew Masoretic text for the Old Testament. Remember, that was the text between 700 and 900 AD, also known as the Ben Asher manuscripts. The Masoretic text was used to actually perform the translation of the Revised Standard Version. The modern English Bibles include the New American Standard Version, which was printed in 1971 as a revision to the 1901 American Standard Version. So again, you have a 1952 Revised Standard Version, and then in 1971, there is a New American Standard Version. This New American Standard Version, today by most scholars, is considered to be the most literally translated Bible to date. It comes closest to what the original Bible actually said. It was copywritten and trademarked, owned by the Lockman Foundation, and produced as an alternative to what? The RSV, the Revised Standard Version, which was considered to be too liberal. Now remember, the commissioning of the Revised Standard Version was the National Council of Churches. That would be the Presbyterian, the United Methodists, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians. Some people were uncomfortable with the kind of radical liberalism that was afoot in those denominations, and so this New American Standard Version was printed by members in the American church who were a bit more conservative than the mainstream of the National Council of Churches. That brings us to the New International Version, which was produced in 1978, a collaboration, and this is very interesting, a collaboration between the Christian Reformed Church and, look at this, the National Association of Evangelicals. So now the Charismatics and the Pentecostals and the Evangelicals are producing a Bible that would, in their estimation, better reflect their doctrine and their denominational preferences. Of the New International Version, it was translated by the New York Bible Society, also known as Biblica, with a minor revision in 1984. Uh, there is afoot a new movement to produce a new uh, international version or a new NIV, and it is said to include inclusive language. And so the characterization of God as a he and male is being modified so that the language of the new NIV would be more inclusive in its references. That brings us to the New Revised Standard Version, printed in 1989 as a revision to the 1952 RSV, produced by the educational arm, again, of the National Council of Churches, and is known for the elimination of archaism. So all of the archaic language that was in both the King James Version, the Revised Version, the Revised Standard Version is eliminated and eradicated in the New Revised Standard Version of 1989. This is very, very important. I think that you ought to take note of this. This New Revised Standard Version is the first Christian Bible to have had input from Jewish scholars. The New Revised Standard Version comes in three editions. There is a Protestant edition, there is a Roman Catholic edition, and then there is something right in the middle called the Common Edition. And that brings us to the last of our modern English Bibles and my personal favorite, and that is the New Living Translation. It was printed and produced in 1996 as a revision to the extremely popular transliterated 1971 Living Bible. It was produced by the widest cross section of Protestant denominational representatives. And I guess because it is so inclusive of so many minds and schools of thought and denominational and doctrinal opinions, that is why it is my personal favorite, because it does have contributions from the widest group of scholars and intelligentsia in the world today. Let me say one final item about the New Living Translation. Uh, it attempts to be simple by using a thought by thought translational approach rather than the older formal equivalents. Now, all of the older Bibles, except the Living Bible, which again is a transliteration, and there would be some that would argue that this New Living Translation is more of a transliteration than it is a translation. Formal equivalence is where the scholars would take a word from the original language and try and find an equivalent word or a word that was equal to that word in the current language that they were translating the Bible into. It was called formal equivalence. Now, the thought by thought method abandoned trying to find, if the word was dog, trying to find the most appropriate word for dog in the language that it was being translated into. The thought by thought approach says that as long as you have the original thought, you can use whatever words and phrases uh, that you would like to, as long as you convey and that you have the integrity of conveying the original thought. Now, I think it is for that reason that the New Living Translation is the easiest to read, except maybe for the new Message Bible that is out, which is also a transliteration that young people enjoy a great deal. But other than the Message Bible, I think the New Living Translation provides the simplest, uh, easiest read of the Bible than all of the other translation. It really kind of breaks it down and makes it most understandable. Well, friends, that takes up all of my time, and I want to thank you for yours. I know this has been a lengthy lecture, but I pray that you have enjoyed it. I want to give you my email address, and it is bishopacl at mindspring.com. That's MIND as in David, spring.com. Again, my email address is bishop, A as in apple, C as in cat, L as in Larry, bishopacl at mindspring.com. I do have some other coursework that's available online, and if this course has meant much to you and you have benefited from it, uh, I would invite you to email me so I can send you some links to some other courses that I have that I think that you will enjoy as well. I am Bishop Andy C. Lewter. You have been watching and listening for the last several minutes How We Got the Bible. It is a webinar on the historical development of the Bible from its inception as a written document all the way to our ability to read and recite it today because it is in a language that we understand. Until next time, please know God loves you, I love you, and we look forward to seeing you real soon.